I know we have more people registered to join, but we'll go ahead and get started. We're excited to have Angela Taylor with us today, and Angela wears a lot of different hats. I'm going to refer to your hat with the DIGNITAS agency, and also your role with Boise Startup Week, which I know has been, you've been a part of that organization for a long time, and have played many different roles there. And so just excited to have you join us today, Angela. Just for context and introduction, my name is Nick Miller. I'm the executive director at the Venture College at Boise State. And gosh, it feels like a long time ago, but back in March or April of this year, we partnered with Trailhead and TM Rostigar, the executive director at Trailhead, and started hosting conversations to try to recreate some of the startup community that we all value when we can meet in person, and trying to bring people that are interested in engaging with that community together digitally, trying to bring subject matter experts like Angela and others into the room so that we can learn from them, engage with them, even though we can't all be physically together. And as Tim and I started talking about what we were going to do in terms of this program, Survive to Thrive, for September, we thought it was a good opportunity for us to preview Boise Startup Week, which is, as Tim can probably tell us, right around the corner. We'll be here before we know it. So we're really excited to welcome Angela today to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a startup ecosystem. And so I for one, am really excited to learn from Angela today. I've had the opportunity to work with Angela as part of the Blue Sky Institute at Boise State and a variety of other arenas. But yeah, welcome, Angela. And I will turn it over to TM, who can get started, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. Share your excitement. Really glad to have Angela here with us today. And in setting the table for today's discussion, I want to start with giving Angela a moment to tell us a little bit about herself, how you ended up here in Boise. We're really blessed to have you, so I'd love to hear a little bit about that story, but really talk about the various businesses that you're involved with. Talk to us about DIGNITAS, tell us about Indulge Boise, and then once we have that baseline, we'll make our way to the food track and diversity, equity, and inclusion as far as Boise Startup Week is concerned. So Angela, why don't you tell us a little about yourself and the various businesses that you run and are involved with?
Perfect. Thanks, Tim and Nick. And before I get started, I just want to thank both of you for creating this platform for those of us sitting at home in our home offices or wherever we are staring at a screen to continue to learn, right? And to get edification in this kind of work from home, really unusual new normal that we're going through. I've enjoyed the Survive to Thrive segments that you've had. And so thank you for creating this platform and bringing some unique voices to the table. And my story, gosh, you know, I will start. I actually was born and raised in Mountain Home. My father was in the Air Force for about 27 years. And for those of you that have either lived in Mountain Home, gone to Mountain Home for I don't know why, what reason, maybe it's to go to Taco John's, or have like passed by in the 2 seconds it takes to pass the 2 exits on I-84. As you can imagine, I couldn't wait to get out of Dodge when I graduated from high school. I didn't know where the grass was greener, but I figured that there were, bigger fish for me to fry somewhere out in the world. And I ended up going to undergrad at Stanford University, where I ended up walking on to the women's basketball team. Sports had been such a large part of my existence in Mountain Home, and just really allowed me to connect with people in the community in a really unique way, as being one of very few minorities in the Mountain Home community at that time. Those 4 years at Stanford actually springboarded a lot of the things that I'm doing today, and I'll bring that connection back through some of the things that we discussed today. But after, graduating with a, economics degree, thought I was going to go to Wall Street and work in the financial sector. But sports just kept showing up in so many different ways. And it wasn't just about the recreation or the activity or, the winning and the competitiveness. It was just about how sports is a really unique way to bring people together in communities. And so much of who I am and how I show up is about using storytelling to connect each of us with ourselves, with others, and with our communities. And so after I graduated, I actually ended up working in the sports industry for about 20 years in a few different capacities. I was a assistant coach in women's basketball for a few years as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I ended up working with the WNBA league office, the Women's National Basketball Association, for about 10 years. And then running 3 WNBA teams, most recently as the president and general manager of the Atlanta Dream. All the teams, we never won a championship, so just got them to the threshold before they won. So Minnesota Lynx won after I left, of course. Washington Mystics won after I left. And Atlanta Dream still haven't won yet, but they're on the cusp. So I don't know if that says much about my leadership styles or capabilities, but if you want to win, hire me and then and then move on. But when I was in Atlanta, my parents were getting older. They retired here in Idaho. And as they were getting older, just felt too far from them and wanted to be closer to be able to help them navigate some health challenges that they were experiencing. And so decided to move back to Idaho. This was literally about 5 years ago. I think it's September 17th, 2015. Moved back to Idaho. Again, when I left Mountain Home, never thought I would come back to Idaho, but I am so glad that I did. And I did because I had the flexibility with my business, the DIGNITAS agency, to work from anywhere. And it's been really a remarkable 5 years being able to do that and other things here in the Treasure Valley.
Very cool. Thank you. Thank you for that intro. So you're a WNBA coach. That's just amazing. But back to your leadership style, someone has to lay the groundwork. We all stand on the shoulder of giants. And so take the credit for the titles. I'm sure Atlanta's gonna win theirs as well. And then you have a three-peat there for you. But you talked about how your parents decided to settle here or move back to Idaho. As I understand it, your father is the president of the local NAACP chapter here. Is that true?
He is, yeah. Going on probably about a decade, yeah.
Very cool. Okay, so lots of, DE&I in the family as well. So tell us a little bit, now that we know more about your background, tell us about Dignitas and the work that you aim to do at that organization.
Yeah, so the Dignitas agency, it's myself and my business partner, Stacy Parson, who's based out of the Bay Area. We were actually teammates on that Stanford team. I was a freshman her senior year, and I'll circle back and tell you a story that really has become one of the foundational elements of what we do with the Dignitas agency. But we're a leadership development, change management, and strategic consulting firm that specializes in particular around equity inclusion work. And we always say we're different, like we're helping leaders lead and to help change organizations. And the biggest change challenge right now is equity inclusion. And so we utilize a lot of our consulting background, our change management and leadership background and coaching certification to help with that. And when I say that sports has been such a guide, if you will, to many of the things that we do, a lot of our approach and our philosophy is steeped in my journey as an athlete, as a coach, as an executive in the sports and entertainment space. And I'll share a quick story with you that Stacey and I always share. Like, this is really our principle. It's, and we've seen it in COVID-19. COVID-19 is fertile ground for disruption and innovation, right? And it's those leaders and those organizations, startups or, organizations that have been around 100 years, right? That are able to pivot quickly and close gaps effectively, which are those that are actually benefiting in this moment, right? Like, they're not worried about what's next. They're actually going to lead what's next and being really innovative and having their teams lean in unique ways. And we talk all the time with our clients about this, and our lens is this. We learned a lot about change and closing gaps quickly my freshman year. my freshman year, I walked onto the team, and in the first meeting we had, Tara Vanderveer, who's the legendary head coach for Stanford University, Hall of Famer, one of the winningest coaches, male or female, in basketball history. As we're sitting in the meeting room, I'm on one side of the room, Stacy's on another side of the room. We don't really know each other. It's one of my first interactions with the team. And Tara comes in and she says, and I'm dating myself a little bit, so if you can't see my gray hair, I'm gonna probably tell you how old I am by telling the story. But she walks in and she says, we're gonna be 1990 NCAA champions. Get comfortable with it. So here I am sitting, you know, on one side of the room. I'm just happy to be on the team, to have made it through conditioning and to have been invited to be part of the team, to have a fresh new pair of Nikes on my feet and some nice Nike gear, right? I'm just happy to be in the room. And frankly, when someone says we're going to win a championship, I'm all in. I'm going to raise my hand and say I'm there, because in Mountain Home, we didn't win very many championships, right? So I was all in. And years later, Stacy actually shared, as we started doing this work, she shared on the opposite side of the room. As a senior, she was like, this lady is crazy. I don't know how she thinks that we're going to close the gap that quickly. So for Stacy, right, when she got to Stanford, they weren't very good. Her junior year, they played in the Sweet 16 against Louisiana Tech, which, you know, perennial top powerhouse of women's basketball at the time. And they played them in Ruston, Louisiana. And she says it felt like it was a blowout by 60 points. I think it was maybe a 20 point loss. But she said it felt that bad, that devastating. And so as she's sitting there listening to Tar say, we're going to be 1990 NCAA champions, she's calculating, how are we going to close that gap, going from 16 to 1 in a matter of months. And not only are we going to have to go get better ourselves and go from 16 to 1, but we're going to have to overcome all these little obstacles, right? All those dragons and demons that are out there, which are the other teams that are pretty good themselves and that are used to winning. Like, how are we going to close the gap that quickly? And then we just like followed Tar's lead. She went from, you know, putting 1990 NCAA champions on our locker room door. It was on the itinerary for all of our trips. Back during VHS tape days, on all of our scouting videos, it was the last slide on the scouting video. It was everywhere, right? And in everything that she did, each drill was intentionally designed to continue to build upon itself, like, right? And we got to be anti-fragile. We were better in practice than we were in games because we challenged each other and the games were easy for us. And when we lost one game, we were 32-1 that year. When we lost that one game, we got better. We were anti-fragile, right? And lo and behold, in late March of 1990, we won the NCAA championship in Knoxville, Tennessee, right? And what we draw upon that experience of like, how do you close a gap when people in the room may not expect it, may not know how to do it? Like, it takes leadership. It takes audacious leadership to have a vision, right? To do real talk, to make this commitment, to have the will, and to build the capacity for your team members to believe it as well, to buy in, to collectively come together to be able to close that gap and move things forward. And so we use a lot of that when we talk about our leadership development, our change management, and in particular our equity inclusion work. Of right now in this challenge, there's a lot of people probably in your rooms, in your offices, who haven't bought into the value of equity inclusion work, right? Who are a little bit unsure about what diversity really means, right? And so there might be somebody that's skeptical in that room. And so what we're trying to do is, how do you close that gap? And it takes audacious leaders to be able to do that. And that's one of the things we love doing.
Let's pick it up right there. I really appreciate the story in terms of being able to identify the gaps and then work together to close them. You know, personally, DE&I, the E is somewhat new to me, just to be perfectly honest. I've always been used to D&I, diversity and inclusion. And so I think there is a need here to better understand. As you said, there might be some people in the room and that hold some hesitancy. And I'm gonna go for the throat on that one. We'll talk about that in a minute, but share with us what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you and why they're important.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that question, Tim, because I think that that's such an important aspect of this work. And Nick, I know you've been involved with some equity inclusion work as well, is sometimes we get stuck on the terminology and the words, right? And because it feels like something that we shouldn't talk about, like, right, we don't talk about money at the table, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about race or, right, diversity, like, right, there's things that are off limits. And so sometimes when we hear these terms, we stop. Like, right, we shut it off because we haven't started to have the conversation in a way that is accessible to everybody. But what's changed literally on May 25th, after the George Floyd killing, was this conversation completely changed. People started to read Robin DiAngelo, and the terminology from diversity, equity, inclusion actually elevated to talking about oppression, right? To talking about dominant culture and white supremacy and different things, terms that like even were off limits to somebody that's in this work. So when I think about diversity, diversity is an easy problem to solve, but diversity is just like the difference, right? There's dimensions of diversity. And it's the characteristics that individuals have, right? So we often think about race and gender when you hear diversity, but there's so many other dimensions. It's ability, it's age, it's socioeconomic status, it's geography, it's culture. Like there's all these different dimensions of diversity. And so maybe a decade or so ago, people started focusing on diversity. Diversity is easy to solve because it's a number, right? You can go out and hire a bunch of folks. You might have to work with your legal team, right, to make sure it's legal. And then inclusion happened because you're hiring all of this diverse population, and you were trying to squeeze them into your culture, right? And so you were trying to say they're culture fit versus the cultural add, right, that they're enhancing the culture. And so we had to come up with inclusion programs to help them feel like, right, they're welcomed at the table, right, and that they're not just tolerated, but they're valued. And then we went from there to equity. And equity and justice is really where, in this moment, and shifting from a moment to a movement, which is really important, is that when we're talking about equity, is we're trying to make sure that things are fair for everybody, that everyone has the same opportunity, and maybe not the same outcomes, but the same opportunity to be successful. I had the same opportunity as Jennifer Azzi, Olympian, Hall of Famer, All-American, to get playing time my freshman year. I wasn't very good. I played 41 minutes my freshman year in 33 games. So 1 minute and 7 seconds a game, right? There was equity, right? We had a chance to compete for it, but I didn't get equal treatment. But equity is really where I think that leaders are starting to take a look at, because there's so many inequities in the system, things that are keeping individuals from being able to thrive, right? Not just survive, but to thrive inside of those organizations. And equity shows up like the Baltimore Museum of Art. I won't go into depth around the story, but early 2020, late 2019, they recognized that only 2% of their portfolio of art was of female artists, 2%. And so they wanted to shift that. And what they recognized is if they use equality, right? If they added equal number of pieces of art, they were never going to close that gap, right? So they were going to have to find equity. And so they made a commitment for, this year to only purchase and add pieces of art that were designed by women. Right.
You bring up this art example. I'm sorry to cut you off. I don't want to lose this thought. It's a great segue into my question. And I promise you, I'm going to go straight for the throat on this one. Okay. As I understood, I listened to NPR and there was a segment on this initiative in the art world. And what I picked up on was an interesting facet of the discussion was that art museums were selling off art pieces from non-diverse groups in order to then procure art pieces from underserved communities and diverse groups. And so the notion that it's either or, you have to sacrifice one for the other. Whereas I believe it was a person who was running one of these museums, she took the approach that, no, that's not really the approach that we want to take. To us, it's and. You don't have to sacrifice one to promote the other. And on that note, since you brought up the museum example, tell us a little bit about this limiting belief that's out there, that there is an inherent compromise to be made between excellence, diversity, and inclusion. What that means is, in the meeting after the meeting, I oftentimes have this conversation where, it's brought up such that, well, if we truly want to commit to DE&I, we will have to hire people who are not as qualified due to them representing certain segments of the population. So there's this inherent belief that there's some kind of compromise to be made. In my experience, it's quite the opposite, but I would like to turn this question over to you and tell us about this limiting belief that there's somehow a compromise to be made. If you commit to DE&I, you are inherently making a compromise on the quality of the work or on the productiveness of the work?
Yeah, that's a loaded one, right? Because that has been present for a long time. And that's a big challenge for people leaders, right? When they're looking to add to their team and you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative somewhere, they're like, well, I don't want to sacrifice quality in order to hire. And I think that one of those things is because there's a limited perspective on who is risky, right? And who is capable. And we need to be able to change that definition, is that there's people all across the spectrum of diversity that are more than capable, that aren't getting opportunities, right? Because they don't have access, right? And when we think about in capitalistic societies, we think and we hear all the time that they're meritocracies, but they don't operate as a meritocracy. They operate as meritocracies. In meritocracies is like people that are making decisions oftentimes, and I was that same way when I was an executive in sports and entertainment. You go out and you seek people that remind you of yourself. So maybe they go to the same school, similar background, you connect with them, they're in your referral network, right? And that's the easy thing to do. But if you're going to change this landscape, right, you have to expand your referral network. And it doesn't mean that you won't be able to find a capable candidate for a position. You may have to do extra work because it's not currently part of your infrastructure to have a diverse population of candidates. But that really, like, that drives me nuts when I hear that, like, because it's immediate, like, and sometimes it's a microaggression. They don't even recognize that they're actually saying it, but I don't want to sacrifice quality. And I would argue two sides of that. One is I think sometimes they already sacrifice quality with somebody that looks like them, that comes from the same school, right? Like sometimes we make hires not because they're the best hire, but because they're the best fits, or because they fit into whatever it is that you've designed. So I want to make sure that we don't recognize that sometimes you don't hire quality all the time. And in this instance, you might have to work harder to actually go find talent. But the conversation about the pipeline's not full or flush of talent inside of the dimensions of diversity, I think is just is a cop out. And it means that people are trying to cut corners and not really do the work and not expand their referral network. And honestly, probably trying to maintain the source of power.
And, you know, to build on that a little bit, Angela, I think this is something that has come up in our discussions with Blue Sky. Is it can be empirically shown that diverse teams have better outcomes than non-diverse teams. And it's, you know, in large part because of, you know, different perspectives and experiences. When you think about innovation and, you know, and new ideas, oftentimes you have to have that diverse set of experiences in order to reach something new. And to kind of pull on that thread a little bit, I'd be curious to know, you know, I know that you do work here locally, but also nationally. And are there ecosystems across the country that you would say are getting it right in terms of being more inclusive or creating more equity within their community? Just, you know, as I know we're here kind of thinking about Boise Startup Week and where we go with the ecosystem as a whole, I'd just be curious to hear if you have any examples of others that have done this well.
Yeah, you know, we call it audacious leaders. There are examples of audacious leaders and those companies that follow that. And what we say that they're committed. So the main thing for organizations to be is committed, knowing what you're committed to, right? If you're committed to being anti-oppressive, right? On that continuum that Nick just referred to, and a lot of the data and the research about being these truly inclusive organizations, if you're committed to something, you're willing to get messy, right? You're willing to make mistakes. And so you see organizations like Ben & Jerry's or Salesforce or Starbucks is a great example, or SurveyMonkey, right? You have this list of these companies that don't always get it right, but you know what they're committed to. So we're willing, right, when they do make a mistake, or maybe when they don't show up in a way that you think they should, right, they're able to quickly pivot, close that gap, and changing it back on track, right? Because they have a track record of being committed. And I think it shows up in pockets, and it really was amplified, Nick, around COVID-19, and certainly around May 25th, when the social unrest really started to peak. I think I'll use Starbucks as an example. So a couple years ago, right, they had the incident in the restroom in Philadelphia. And so they decided they were going to close their stores for a day, have, you know, unconscious bias training. around the country, and then they came out of it and decided they were going to make their restrooms accessible for everybody. Right? There were a lot of different people in this industry that weren't quite sure if that was the right solution, but we knew they had a history. They've been doing this for decades. They've been committed to equity inclusion, so you knew that they were going to try to get it right. Right? And there's other organizations right now in this moment that they're leading with fear. And oftentimes when fear is present, you get in a compliance mode. And so you're leading with the legal team is setting your D&I strategy, right? Or it's conflict or crisis. And sometimes in those situations, it's your communications team that's leading the crisis with a statement. But if you can get to commitments and knowing where you are, building the capacity, knowing where your leadership alignment is, then you can start to, again, be willing to take chances and to take risks and really thrive in this space.
So Angela, as you're talking about organizations who are making an authentic effort, I'll call it that, and in that effort, there's gaps and there's going to be, call them failures, setbacks. There's one term that you used in the past that sort of caught my attention because I'd heard it before, and English not being my first language. I had to go look it up and what it really meant. You used the term allyship, and you described it as the relationship that you can build between two parties. Talk to me a little bit about allyship and the work that you've been doing with DIGNITAS locally here. And what do you hear from leaders here in our community when it comes to DE&I? What's on top of their mind?
Yeah. So allyship is great because you had a lot of those conversations in June, right? Where people, particularly, white leaders, white men and white women who were like, what can I do? Like, this is not okay. And now all of a sudden have a different visibility into what's going on. And so how can I help? What's the work to be done? And so allies started to show up as like those individuals that now at least had a little bit of a perspective. And we're trying to get allies to click up to another level. And some are calling it accomplice and being an accomplice. We call it being audacious. And that's actually being willing not just to be aware of it, but to change, to actually be someone willing to go above and beyond and to risk, to risk your job or to risk, many other things, to actually fight for what you believe is right. And so that's what audacious leaders, they take risks, they speak real talk. They really understand where oppression shows up in the equation. And they have a will and a fortitude or a grit that helps them be anti-fragile when this is it's a VUCA environment, It's volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous. And they understand how to navigate that successfully. And then your second question is what are we hearing from leaders? One of the top things that we're hearing is, how do we navigate the difference between what is political and what's business, we have leaders say look, I don't want to be retaliated by the legislature if we do something. And we know the administration has actually had no federal agency is able to have diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And that came out about a week ago. When we talk about that, we say that there's a difference between politics with a capital P, which is partisanship, and politics with a lowercase p, which is policy, programs, all of those things that we do on a daily basis, no matter what industry you're in, We're always we're policy wonks, There's lobbyists that are dictating for healthcare, for education, for startups, that's what happens. So that's one of the big things. And then the other thing is, how do we consider business risk? And we start to really have the conversation about trade-offs. What are you willing to trade off? Are you willing to do business in China, and what does that look like? And start to be intentional about that. What does your investment portfolio look like, for your retirement plans? Does it have some risky investments that aren't in alignment with your stance around equity inclusion? A lot of those questions, but Tim, the thing that shows up the most is fear. Simply fear with leaders. And so we get a lot of questions, and we'll try to keep clicking down to get to the root of what that is, what's showing up, and it's fear. They don't want to be the one that's not doing enough. They don't want to be out there not knowing what they're doing or misspeaking in the cancel culture kind of world, and there's a lot of fear that's showing up that's preventing them from actually being committed and being audacious in these moments. And so we help them deal with that fear. and talk through it and recognize and acknowledge it's real. Like, right, to your point, it's a limiting belief, but the breakthrough belief is that I've been, afraid before, and I know how to actually leverage fear for change.
Yeah, that fear is especially magnified, I think, in this accelerated environment. And when I say accelerated environment of change, with the pandemic and the killing of George Floyd, I think we find ourselves, and I'll speak for myself here for a moment. I have some of that fear, to be quite frank with you, because it's such an important topic and issue, and it's so visceral and embedded in our history that, quite frankly, I'm afraid to make a mistake or maybe say the wrong thing. And so as you work with leaders, you call them audacious leaders, and this is a comment with a lowercase p when it comes to politics. Our mayor the other day during her State of the City address was very frank about her audaciousness. She said Black Lives Matters. She also talked about equity and access in terms of our community being able to participate in economic development. So when you hear a leader like that in our community, with the history that we have here in Boise and in Greater Idaho, come out and say something like that, what does that make you feel like? Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think that it's actions and words, right? And I think for Mayor McLean to make a strong statement and talk about her commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion as a leader for the city of Boise, and to name it, right? To talk about the systemic inequities that we've seen and the systemic racism that has occurred here in Idaho. And I think she mentioned Aryan Nation. She talked about housing discrimination, right? She named those things at a time when not a lot of leaders are saying the thing, right? That's how audacious leaders do show up, right? Is that it's real talk. That's one of our principles for our company is real talk. And we weren't showing up with real talk prior to May 25th. We weren't using and naming the things because we were kind of soft pedaling. We were trying to bring people in and have conversations and make people feel comfortable in this space. And now we're speaking real talk. And so, no, I applaud Mayor McLean for speaking that real talk. And now here's the opportunity. And what we are seeing is there's two different things that are happening in the ecosystem. So one is whether it's on campus with Nick, right, where there's students, or it's inside of organizations where you have employees. The employees want things to happen yesterday, right? They're waiting for you to make a decision and a commitment to this work yesterday. And leaders, because they're navigating fear and they have a little bit more exposure, their risk profile is different, right? They're being a little bit more intentional and cautious, trying to weigh all the constituents that they have to navigate and to acquiesce, like, right, and appease in this conversation. So for a leader to be able to show up that way, and then actually to give leverage to those in the organization who actually want to do this work and want to come up with some policies and programs that are going to identify and get rid of those inequities in the system, that's a great start. So I was encouraged by that in our community. I look forward to seeing what's next to come as an action.
To build on that a little bit, Angela, obviously acknowledging and calling it out is a really strong and necessary first step. And short of hiring DIGNITAS to do the work alongside you, what are some of the resources or areas that you would point people to? Because I think, to just a little bit on what TM said, I think a lot of people right now are very much inclined to start doing some of the work, but it may feel overwhelming, or it may feel like, if I step out there and I make a mistake, what are the ramifications? And so maybe the safer thing is to just be static. And I know that's, obviously goes against what we're talking about. So what would you point people to get started in this work in their own organization?
I would say really start to do your work, right? Is if you understand who you are, how you show up, what your perspective is, where that fear is showing up, and how that may impede you from actually leading in the space, right, then you can start to, again, disrupt. So I have fear, right? I'm hesitant in certain places. I'm worried about, something that I may say or do, what the ramifications of that may be. So fear exists, right? And so, we call them demons, right? The demons and the dragons. First, you have to be able to name them and identify them, how they show up and how they actually may impede you being able to do the work. Be able to show up fully as an audacious leader. And a lot of this work is really around, it's a combination between the action and the somatic side, right? The somatic side is really understanding like how you are showing up in your body. Where does fear show up? How does fear, does it paralyze you from actually being able to take an action or to do anything? Do you have some healing that needs to take place, right? Because there's two sides of this equation. There's, if you will, the oppressors and the oppressed, right? So oftentimes those that are the underrepresented groups are asked to lead this work and they're still healing themselves. We had a training the other day, the day after the Breonna Taylor indictment came out. And it was tough, right? But we brought it into the room and had that conversation, right? Because it is part of the process. So that's the first thing, is to start with you, is to understand how are you showing up and what am I willing to do? What am I committed to doing on that spectrum that you speak to Nick about, showing up as someone that's going to encourage others to do this work, or somebody that's going to be willing to be an accomplice, an ally, or an audacious leader in the space. And then when you don't know, like if we don't know how to do something as parents, right? You don't know how to parent the first day you have a child, but you figure it out, right? And so leaders figure stuff out. We have great leaders that don't have a marketing background, don't have a technical background, don't have like backgrounds that are essential to their business practice, but they figure it out. Like diversity, equity, inclusion is one of those things. It's not an extra thing. It's not an add-on. It's not something that is only the job of someone in HR or in equity inclusion. And it's not only something that an underrepresented person can help lead, right? And so if you do the work and if you figure out what you're committed to, then you can close the gap, right? You don't have to have all the answers yesterday, right? But if you know what you're committed to, if you're willing to get messy, if you're willing to lead in this space, then there's a lot of different tools and programs that are out there and available to guide you through the process.
I love that, Angela. Well, obviously you're passionate about this, but also the things that matter to us, we figure out, right? The things that drive our outcomes, we figure out. No one's sitting around saying, I might screw up my marketing campaign, so I guess I won't do one, right? So, that, I think that's just such a powerful way to frame it. And, I think what have you seen that in this ecosystem has given you hope in Boise that people are working on figuring this out? What makes you feel positive about the direction that we're moving as a community?
Yeah, I think here in Boise and beyond, something that has shifted in the last, two things that I would isolate that have shifted in the last few months. One is that we're actually talking about the thing. Like, we're not afraid of it. Like, we're actually having these conversations. And two is where those conversations are taking place. Previously, a lot of the conversations were taking place in HR, right? And, diversity and belonging offices or equity inclusion offices. And it's still taking place there. But now, like for us, we are having conversations with the CEO and his or her direct reports, like on a regular basis. And what that is allowing is this cascading down, right? That's the most leverage you have in this moment to get something done, to get those significant shifts in a short amount of time, is for your senior leaders and your C-suite leaders to actually lead the change and to determine the direction. Because once they determine the direction and make a commitment to it, then downstream, your employees, your DEI councils, your equity inclusion officers, or your HR practitioners, like now they know, like they don't have to push this heavy boulder uphill anymore, right? The load has been lightened significantly. And that's one of the main things that has been changed is here in the Treasure Valley, we're having conversations with leaders at the top of the hill, and they're having this conversation, they're being vulnerable. I'm talking about the fear that's showing up and understanding that because we don't have a lot of racial diversity doesn't mean that this work isn't important, right? It's actually more important. for us, particularly as we're starting to build this ecosystem here in Idaho, and we want to live into the vision that we have for this city and what we all believe it to be. So I'm encouraged by that. Stacy and I always talk about Boise as our innovation hub. Right. So I know, for you both in Trailhead, you would enjoy that. But literally 4 years ago, Nick, when we started this work with you a little bit, when we were talking to those 40 CEOs, Stacy at that time was a little bit skeptical. It was like, okay, Angela, I'll do a favor for you, right? I might get some Basque food for the first time or whatever. So I'll come to Boise and do this work. But as we were in conversation with leaders, it's just a different atmosphere than it is in other markets where there's some competition, you're in silos, you can't necessarily get to the right people in a coalition. And here in Boise, there's just a different percolating going on in this moment. So I'm excited about it, and it's still challenging. I'm disappointed, right? So every conversation that I'm excited about, there's another conversation that you're a bit disappointed around, but encouraged that we're further along today than we were yesterday.
Yeah, on that note, Angela, so oftentimes I find myself questioning the authenticity of the effort that I'm putting forth, okay? And so, and let's talk about Startup Week for a moment. I recall 2 years ago, my first Startup Week, after we had our event, everyone's high-fiving, we just got done with the thing that everybody put 6 months into. We got a comment from someone encouraging us to deepen our pool of speakers to include more diversity of thought. Quote unquote, that's what that person said. And diversity of thought, we talked about it earlier. Yes, it's rooted in demographic diversity and racial diversity, but it's really the end result being the diversity of thought. And so as we tackled this issue at Startup Week, Nick, my fellow co-chair, and I, we looked at each other and we said, and we joke about this, we say, when it comes to DE&I, Startup Week is doing fairly well. We have a gay man and a refugee who are in charge of this event, but we didn't feel comfortable, and it didn't feel authentic for us to pick up the racial baton. Yeah. And even though I'm from a different, racial background, I still didn't feel comfortable. And so we approached you, right? And so when you talk about this top-down approach, Nick and I top-down, we said, yes, the feedback is warranted. It's merit-based. We need to do better. We look at each other and we go, well, if you and I lead this charge, it's probably not going to come across authentic. So what do? We found really an advocate, a champion in you to help us carry this baton throughout Boise Startup Week. And so as organizations do that, what do you say to this? It's a bit of an imposter syndrome, this lack of authenticity if TM were the one leading it. What are your thoughts on, what would you say to leaders who find themselves thinking in the same terms?
Yeah, we get it, right? Like, I think that's an obstacle, right? There's a lot of folks that are showing up and they don't want to be perceived as I have all the answers, right? And so, I'm going to be the white savior, if you will. Right? And what does that look like? And then there are some groups, right? Some activist groups that don't want that to be the solution. And so it's a balance. Right now in this moment, when we're asking underrepresented groups to carry the heavy load, right? Up until this point, right? We've been asking those groups to carry the load, that this is your responsibility to see change. But change happens where there's privilege and there's power. And right now, currently, privilege and power resides most likely, typically, particularly in this market, with white men. Right. And so, how can we get the white men who are leaders in this market, who want to see change, how can we get them comfortable leading? And it doesn't mean they have to do all the work, right? But they have to be the ones that set the table. They have to be the ones that are setting the direction and allowing everybody else to be able to play their role extremely well. So they're Tara. Tara had to set the vision. We're going to be 1990 NCAA champions. And it was the players, not me, because I only played 41 minutes, but it was the players who were actually talented enough that could take that vision and bring it to life. So it's a little bit of both, right? And what we know, the system is going to be slower to change than we all want it to be. So we're still operating within that system, but the most leverage comes from the top. And what needs to happen is what Alex Ohanian, everyone knows him as Serena Williams' husband, I guess, or the father of her daughter. But he stood up right in the midst of this, right? And I think it was probably in April or May. And he stepped aside from his board role to make room for somebody else. Right, that's leadership, is being willing to give something up in order to actually invest in equity, inclusion, and justice. And that's how that shows up. So we need more leaders to do that. And there's fear behind that, right? There's fear of giving up power because it feels like this zero-sum game. But if you understand what Nick alluded to before, that the value of equity inclusion, right? It amplifies, it floats everyone's boat, right? It's a bigger piece of the pie if we really understand what that is. And I gotta be honest, like, you know, we're kind of done with the business case for diversity, right? This is about humanity. This is about humanity, right? And so if we truly believe in all the words that we say we are, and Tim, as you coming to this country, like of who we say we're showing up as in the United States, it's about humanity. Everyone deserves an opportunity to thrive, right? In some way, shape, or form. And if you're a leader, right, don't you want everyone to have that opportunity? And it shouldn't be about all those dimensions. Like, it should be that everyone has that opportunity. And in the short term, we're gonna have to close some gaps for groups that have been oppressed.
What better way to demystify all of these silos into this is about humanity, and that's a common denominator we all should be able to relate to.
Yeah.
I want to pivot to Startup Week. I'm having a really good time in this conversation. I don't want to lose the thread of DE&I as we talk about Startup Week, but
Sure.
You've been involved for years. You know, I call you the queen of the food track because you were all things food to us when it comes to Startup Week. And you also have a site startup, another one, let's call it, Indulge Boise. And tell us a little bit about Indulge, what the status is of it, and then touch on the things we can expect for Food Track at Startup Week, if you can.
Yeah, no, thanks for mentioning that. So yeah, Indulge is it was my side hustle, right? And it's become something that's really important to me. As I mentioned before, kind of my life purpose is using storytelling to connect us to ourselves, to others, and to communities. And Indulge Boise, through the culinary experiences that we curate, has allowed us to connect people to themselves, to their stories, right? To remembering back to that meal that you had with your grandmother, or the smell in the dining room when you're at home for Thanksgiving, like all those things that we connect with each other around in a time where we don't usually do that. Like, right, we're all on our phones and doing different things. So Indulge Boise, I launched it in the summer of 2016 to help people connect with the things about Boise that I love, the things that maybe people didn't always have an awareness of, the history, the amazing architecture, the talented chefs and breweries, and like things that we have right here in this city that can compete with Austin or Portland or Seattle. The amazing story that was happening here around the food and beverage industry. And so we take guests on these amazing experiences. It's been a really challenging time for us. We had to make some difficult decisions. In mid-March, we decided to shut it down and just to protect our customers, our tour guides, and really just our tasting partners, right? Of understanding we're bringing 16 people into their space, right? That just didn't seem safe. And so we waited to see what was going to happen with the different phases in the rollout. And then in late June, we made the difficult decision to actually pause operations until March, until we can safely operate and have these extraordinary experiences where we're not having to wear masks, where we're actually able to interact with the chefs or the owners. That's such a huge part of it, is when we walk into Bacon and John Berryhill comes over to the table and he talks about his story and he connects with the guests. Those sorts of things were really remarkable, important to us. Yeah, so that kind of led to the food track, which again, Tim, you've had such a huge part in the evolution of the food track, and as you've led the signature event for the food track with Trail Mix.
Again, standing on the shoulders of giants, a lot of credit goes to Matthew Gilkerson, our program manager, who's been working side by side with you this year as co-chairs of the food track. Trail Mix, we all look forward to it. It's the pitch competition that we all learned to love over the years. Are there any other talks or panel discussions and what are they highlighting this year? I heard food insecurity kind of floating around when it came to the food track. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate how you say standing on the shoulders of giants. And I'm doing that this year with Matthew. Matthew has been fantastic the last few months and really leading the charge with a lot of these initiatives, and so proud of the efforts that he's doing to put together another amazing year with a food track. So in addition to trail mix, which you could probably do a great job of summarizing, we have a keynote with Louis Armstrong, who is one of the founders of Kilauea Creamery. And they've just had an amazing kind of story the last year or so as they've raised some capital and are knocking it out of the park, using my sports analogies. So a great kind of fireside chat with him, and with Jeff Reynolds is the MC for that. So just a really great conversation. We did, like, the theme for Boise Startup Week is be resilient. So we talked about resiliency in the food space. I think all of us have experience in this work from home, making sourdough or banana bread, right? Or going to the grocery store and not having all of your ingredients available on the grocery store shelves. And so we talked to a panel in the supply chain, just about, like, so what has shown up in the supply chain? What are some of the challenges, some of the inequities that maybe we didn't have visibility into before, and some of the things that we've shifted now to course correct, and what we can do moving forward. So we have a great panel that will talk about that. We're talking about food insecurity. Here in Idaho, I want to say maybe 1 in 6 kids and 1 in 8 adults are food insecure. And certainly with school not in session, for the end of last year, and then some working from home or going to school from home now, they're not getting that meal that they typically get at school. And so we have a conversation with Karen from the Idaho Food Bank, with Kathy Holland from Albertsons, and just kind of talk about food insecurity and what we're doing here in our ecosystem to support that. And then I'm going to have a great conversation with Chris Kamori, who I call the culinary legend here in the Treasure Valley at KIN. Again, just an innovator and influencer, such a great perspective and point of view on a lot of different things. And so we have a fireside chat where we'll kind of get into what it's like to be a restaurant owner in the time of COVID, how you pivot, particularly how you have sustainable staffing during this difficult time. So those are a few of the highlights, but I'm really excited about the food track and Boise Startup Week and what you guys have done to make a virtual event feel like it's going to be extraordinary.
I'm really happy that you and Matt were able to include food insecurity this year, because, back to DE&I, we talk about equity and access. Yeah. Being food insecure, arguably, is a lack of access for some of our community members. So, while Startup Week is, much about highlighting startups, pitching for prize money, there's also another side to it, and that's food insecurity this year. We want to cover. I know Chobani also has done, a few initiatives in that space. We look forward to hearing from them. Angela, it amazes me in terms of the number of hats that you wear, how well you wear them. I mean, we talked about DIGNITAS, we talked about Indulge Boise. We also talked about the work you do with the Blue Sky Institute, the Boise Startup Week food track. Is there anything that Angela Taylor can't do, I might ask?
I can't cook. That's why, the food tours are a key thing. And in the time of COVID where you can't get to your hairdresser, that it's difficult to wear all these different hats for sure. But I did want to, I see there's a question from Ava, team, if I can, in the chat room. And she asks if I can explain what I mean by being anti-fragile. And I'll quickly just summarize that is the best example I can use to define that is Urban Meyer, who was a longtime coach with the Ohio State football team. He was at University of Florida for a little bit, University of Utah before that, but great coach. And he has a book out, but he talks a little bit about this using an analogy or a metaphor for it. So oftentimes when we look at bad teams, right? Bad teams are fragile. So when they lose, it's just, they completely tank, right? There's tension, there's friction in the air. The people on the team aren't getting along. They're not listening to the coach. They're not buying into what's going on. And bad teams just completely, just go into the tank. Good teams are resilient, right? So when good teams lose, they come back and they're like, okay, we lost. We're going to try to, win the next time. Anti-fragile teams actually get better after they lose. right? And those are championship teams. And that's what, you know, when I was a freshman, again, 1990, we went 32-1. We lost to the University of Washington, up at Washington. It was a brutal game, right? One of our big rivalries at that time. And we got better. That next practice was brutally intense. There was probably a lot of blood, sweat, and tears left on the floor that Monday, but we got better. Right. And so that's what being anti-fragile is. Being resilient, like you can only go so far, but at some point you're going to break, right? If you're resilient. If you're anti-fragile, you welcome the challenge. You welcome the pressure, the stress, right? And so in this moment, when we talk about equity inclusion, right? If you're an audacious leader, you're anti-fragile, like you know what's going to happen. There's not going to be, everyone's not going to agree with you and your perspective or what you're committed to, but it's going to make you stronger and more committed to whatever it is that you're hoping to accomplish.
Thanks, Angela. And I think that TM and Nick now have to rebrand as Be Anti-Fragile instead of Be Resilient for Boise.
Resiliency is good. Grit and resiliency is good.
We'll start with resilience, right? And aspire to anti-fragility. But I think we're almost out of time, and I see that some folks are jumping off. But first of all, just wanted to say thank you, Angela. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for what you do in our community. And thanks for volunteering your time for Boise Startup Week. I know it's a huge lift, and I'm excited to hear about everything from, you know, the food insecurity to Lewis and where he's gone, you know, an early member of Trailhead that has really gone out and seen some amazing success. And thanks to TM for helping host not only Survive to Thrive, but Boise Startup Week as a whole. And thank you to everyone who joined. The community is what makes this all possible. So we will be back in a couple of weeks with another Boise Startup Week preview. So watch for that. And thanks again to our guest, Angela Taylor with Dignitas and numerous other things. And we will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye for now, everyone.